I heard it at first. For a moment, I thought the whistling was from a train. The station was a few streets away, but it was still just close enough to the house to hear the late-night blast from the final train of the evening, bound for London. But even as I thought that, the grandfather clock at the bottom of the stairs began to strike. We had so many clocks in the house that keeping them all running at the correct time was virtually impossible. Every hour, or rather for a few minutes after, the house was filled with chiming as each one sounded off in turn. It was definitely 12. The last train left at 11:15, so it couldn't be the train. I tensed up. Listening more closely, the thin, reedy note that had pierced the cold winter fog wavered slightly. On and on it went, longer and longer, like the whine of a kettle abandoned on a fire until it boils dry. It went on until my ears rang, and all I wanted to do was run to the window and throw it open and scream, "By God, stop!" But I didn't. There was a chill in my heart that seemed to reach into my very core. I turned my book, one of Poe's fantastical horrible tales, down upon the table next to me and took a breath. The whistling was growing louder, as if the person or thing was coming closer and closer to the house. My breathing was shallow, and my heart was pounding inside my chest, threatening to burst through my ribs to spill upon my lap. I glanced over at the book. That's all it is, I thought to myself, the book. I'm just unsettled because of the book and the lateness of the hour. I nodded and snatched the book up again, tucking a mark between the pages. I closed it quickly and thrust it out of sight into a desk drawer. That's all it is, just the book. I slammed the desk drawer closed much harder than I had intended. The bang echoed slightly, made that much louder when compared to the stillness of the house. Had it been midday, when my mother and the servants were twittering around the house, their noise should have drowned out some of the intensity, but it was not midday, and there were no servants or family around. Outside, the whistling stopped just for a second. My eyes widened to saucers. When I glanced over at the window pane, had it heard me? I asked myself. Was it coming? I didn't even know what it was, and the thought of it approaching was truly terrifying. Then the whistling resumed, the same toneless, endless note. I heard a sigh of relief and snatched for my handkerchief, so that I might wipe my forehead. Outside the window, the whistling grew a little louder, piercing through the evening fog. I mopped my brow and glanced at the handkerchief. It was vertically drenched in sweat, and I felt a momentary rush of anger at my own fear. Stuffing the handkerchief back into my pocket, I steeled myself and stepped towards the window. The curtains hung, thick and heavy, over the window. I pressed myself into the corner of the room and twitched one curtain aside, peeking out. The street looked much as it always did. The comfortable orange glow of the gas lamps danced over the cobblestone street, and the chimneys belched out their unusual stacks of smoke, adding to the haze of smog that hung over the rooftops. Somehow the pollution added to the feel of winter. I stood in the shadows of my room and waited. The only lights left in my room were the dying embers of the fire and glow of candle that was nearly equal dead. I should have felt safe there, cloaked in the darkness of the night, and yet something nagged at me. Outside on the street, everything was still. Too still. Absolutely no one and nothing moved, and even the wind seemed to have stilled itself entirely. The one sound that was a natural whistle, and the only movement came from the curtain as I let it fall back across the window pane. My mother's words echoed in my mind. Every day, or rather, every night, she'd remind me to go to sleep. "Make sure you're asleep by midnight," she had told me, always remembering the same warning. It's not safe at night. I couldn't remember when she had first said that to me. I fancied that there was some time, when I was a small child, still swaddled in the comfort of my own youthful naivety. Some time before she had begun warning me to sleep. The whistle droned on. I twitched the curtain again, just for a moment, and checked outside. Still nothing. That in itself was odd. I was used to it, because the fact that the entire town was silent overnight. It was normal for us, and yet it was odd compared to others. I knew from the stories that I read, from the news in the papers, and from the correspondence of friends who lived elsewhere, that most towns thrived at night. Why, one of my friends had said the nighttime streets of London bustled as much as during the day, and another had described Paris as a city that never slept. And yet, every night come 11:30, Inkbarrow withdrew into itself. The church bells would ring the half hour, and those townspeople left the streets would hurry home. The whole town huddled itself inside, behind latched doors and thick curtains, and waited for the dawn. Only once had anyone ever hinted to me why that was the case. Every Christmas, on the eve of St. Stephen's Day, we would treat the servants to wine and cake as a special treat to celebrate the Lord. It was only 2 years ago, when I had been just shy of 16, that one of them had finally let slip the secret. Mortimer, the footman, had always been a heavy drinker. The whiff of the stuff clung to him at all times, like a faint aroma of shame that followed everywhere he went. Still, he was tall, abnormally so, 6'7". If the whispered admirations of the maids weren't to be believed, from a distance he was by far the most impressive footman in the town. Nothing ever seemed to frighten him. At least, that was what I had thought. But that night, as Mortimer had slowly guzzled on his way through the wine, I had seen something on his face, a shadow, the kind that evoked the castle of Ortonto, or made one think of Shelley's monster lurking in the dark. "Why, you look as if you've seen a ghost," I had said. More in jest than anything, Mortimer had laughed, but a hollow, mocking laugh. "Aye, sir, that I have," he had said, taking another long pull of alcohol. "One of the few that have, I'd wager." "Why, whatever do you mean?" He laughed again and then looked at me. The eyes had flashed, widened, and he looked again. "You don't know the story, do you, sir?" "Story? What story? My God, Mortimer, whatever has gotten into you, man?" "I saw it, sir, stalking the streets." He paused, staring down into the dregs of his glass. "I was out late at night, hadn't heard the bell, you see. Not until too late. Not until they were ringing 12. I ran home, I did, but I saw it." "Saw what, Mortimer?" "A demon, sir. A demon with the face of a child." That had put a chill into my veins. We had sat in silence, an ocean of troubled tranquility amidst the gaiety of the party. What was it doing? Just standing there and staring. Red eyes. It had burning eyes. I could see them a mile off, I'd wager. Just standing and watching. "Did it see you?" "No, thank God, no. They say if it sees you, it takes you. Nothing you can do, nowhere you can go. It'll get you, or so they say. I must have got lucky. That was the night old McInnes died. It must have seen him, and his voice chilled off. I don't know. It seemed like it was just standing there, waiting." "What was it waiting for?" "McInnes?" I'd asked. He looked at me, as if he was summoning the courage to tell me. Then he shuddered and turned away. "God, sir, I don't know. Maybe for him, maybe for something else. If I knew that, I wouldn't be sitting here. That's what I think," Mortimer had said. He didn't say a word to anyone for the rest of the night, and very few to me since. But his words, and the demeanor they had come with, that had struck me. Ever since then, I had been so desperate to see it myself. A few times I had even stayed up, but every time my mother's words had came back to me. Until as a man, I was living under her rules, and I had to respect her. "Honor thy mother and thy father." And so, every night, I had gone to bed before the clocks had rung midnight. But I was 18 now. I was a man. I would fear nothing, so I had read my book and glanced at my pocket watch, and steadily fast refused to dress for bed. The hours had crawled slowly, but finally it was here, the witching hour, and yet there was nothing. Nothing but the whistling. It was growing louder, or I thought perhaps it wasn't louder at all. Perhaps it was a simple getting closer. I tugged the curtain, gently moving it once more, and staring down at the street below. Again I saw nothing, and I heaved a sigh of disappointment, of relief. I found myself wondering. But just before I had let the curtain go, I had seen a shadow. In any other town, such a thing would have been unremarkable, but not so in Inkbarrow. No, one went out at night, and even the animals seemed to avoid the town after dusk. Those few stray cats or dogs that ventured out never seemed to last long. And yet there was a shadow outside, moving on the road. I froze, and my hand becalmed itself upon the curtain. I watched as the shadow bobbed, slowly stretched out across the cobbles. Little by little, it formed itself into the shape of a man, or a boy, said a strained whisper somewhere near the back of my head, and it ambled further down the street. The shadow had been stretched unnaturally and painfully long by the position of the lights. As it kept walking, the shadow started to lessen again, shrinking down to a more natural size. The whistling grew louder as ever, and I watched, gripping with fascinated fear, as the figure finally disappeared. It was a boy, just as Mortimer had said. It could not have been more than 5 or 6, and skinny. The clothes were strange, at once expensive looking and fine, and yet shabby and covered in fine soot that one would expect of a chimney sweep. The boy moved past me, and I could only see the back of the strange child. From that angle, it did not seem so terrifying, and I found myself relaxing slightly. To my surprise, my heart was pounding in my chest, and I had quite forgotten to breathe for some time. I took a deep breath, and I placed my free hand upon my chest, trying to still my heart. It was another moment before I realized that the whistle had changed. It was no longer the single sound, the long, continuous whine of before. Now it had developed into a reedy but recognizable melody. "Pop goes the weasel," I murmured. I loved that song as a child, and it had sounded so beautiful in my mother's voice. But the child outside, the demon, the whatever it is, just repeated the same 5 notes over and over again. "Pop goes the weasel. Pop goes the weasel. Pop goes the weasel." I shivered, and the curtain, still gripped in my hand, flapped a little. Outside, the figure stopped in its tracks. My eyes widened, and my heart thudded inside my chest again, pounding upon my ribs like a hammer upon a drum. The whistling stopped. Once again, I found that I was holding my breath. My lungs positively burned with the need to breathe, but fear had me in its icy grip. And I did nothing. I watched, rocking slightly on my heels as my head swam, as the child turned, and again I heard the whistling. It seemed distant for a moment, but I realized that was just because of my own fear, and the blood rushing in my ears. Everything seemed to be distant, as if I was listening to the world whistle. My head was held under the surface in a bathtub. I gasped for air and focused. The child was still turning slowly, but the whistling was louder now. It was all that I could hear. The song played over and over again, more perfectly now. Involuntarily, I began to mumble the words, as if the tear in my soul were causing me to regress to childhood. "Half a pound of turnipy rice, half a pound of treacle," I said, my voice barely louder than the rustle of the curtains. "Mix it up and make it all nice. Pop goes the weasel." A shadow passed over the child's face, and for a moment my mind was flooding with images and memories. Gruesome facsimiles of what the authors I loved had described. Then I thought of something that I had read in a magazine. One of the Penny Dreadful's mothers hated so much. Pop goes the weasel, according to some, was slang used in darker parts of London as a slang for cutting your throat. I thought of myself meeting the fate, my throat slashed in the street as that demon child looked on. But that image quickly dissolved. Instead, my mind was flooded with something else. Something worse. Something so much worse. It wasn't a thought, really, but more a feeling. A sense of clarity and certainty. The words of the nursery rhyme formed on my lips again, answering the whistle, and yet I knew for a fact that those were not the words the child had thought of. On the cobbles, the child took a step forward. The pleasant orange glow of the gas lamps fell upon his face, and my heart stopped inside my chest. Mortimer had been right about the burning red eyes, but he had forgotten something, or perhaps he had never seen. After all, at a distance in the darkness, consumed by his fright, it would be easy to miss. The child's eyes locked mine, and every hair on my body stood on end. I felt my stomach twist, and it was only the fact I was utterly frozen in place that stopped me from bending and vomiting upon the floor. The child's eyes, those burning red eyes, flashed with a smile, but the rest of its face remained still. It would have been a handsome child. The forehead was shapely, as was the nose. The eyes, if they were a more natural color, could have even been described as captivating. It would have been a handsome child, but for one glaring defect. Where the mouth should have been, there was a simple line, stitched closed in its face, just as Sheely's beast was stitched together from corpses. This thing's mouth had been sewn closed. The whistle rang in my ears, and then I heard a thud behind me. I spun around. What I had thought was fear before was nothing compared to this. I began to gasp for breath, hyperventilating. My hands shook, my entire body quivered, and tears began to spring in my eyes. The thud had clearly been my bedroom door closing, and standing there, with its back against the wood, was the second child. The nightdress it wore was stained with blood. Long streaks ran the whole length down the front, from the collar to the knees. It wasn't hard to see where the blood came from. This child, unlike the one outside, had a perfect mouth, but blood-dripping holes where its eyes should have been. "Oh God, Lord Jesus, save me," I choked out. There was no answer but the whistling, and then the child stopped. Silence reigned for a moment, and the mouth curled into a wicked grin as it began to sing in time with the nursery rhyme. "Two little boys and only one tongue, the only two eyes to see from," the child sang. The voice was beautifully haunting, but beautiful. There was a pause, just for one beat, and then the grin widened. Blood-streaked teeth showered over the pale lips as I waited to finish its song. The child was between me and the door. There was no way out. Instead, I spun around, intending to dive out the window and try to run, only to choke again in fear and stumble back. The second child was there, clinging to the brickwork of the house somehow, with his face pressed against the window. Those red eyes burned in my very soul, just as I felt the hands on my back and the voice begin to sing. "Two little boys and only one tongue, and only two eyes to see from. But like little boys, we like having fun. Try not to scream now." Okay, that was the Dead of Night story by Puzzled Robot. I hope you guys enjoyed that story, as I did. And the link to the original story will be in the description. Thank you everyone for listening in.